They called it a victory. Washington celebrated. Tel Aviv celebrated. The headlines screamed that the axis of evil had finally been decapitated. March 1, 2026, the day American and Israeli airstrikes killed Ali Khamenei, supreme leader of Iran, the man who had held the Islamic Republic together for over 3 decades. But here's what nobody in those celebrating newsrooms was asking. The last time America killed a regime's top figure and declared victory, the war that followed lasted 20 years, cost $2 trillion, and ended with a chaotic evacuation from an airport. So the question isn't whether killing Khamenei was impressive. The question is, what did America just walk into? Welcome to GEOLOBBY, where we go past the headline and into the machinery underneath it. Today we're doing exactly that. We're going to look at what history actually says happens after moments like this. We're going to look at the specific structural reality of Iran that most Western analysts are underestimating. And then we're going to look at who is quietly benefiting from all of this, and it's not who you think. Let's start with the pattern, because there is a pattern, and it is not subtle. March 2003, American tanks roll into Baghdad. Saddam Hussein, a brutal dictator who had ruled Iraq through terror for 24 years, is toppled. The statue falls. The White House declares a turning point in the war on terror. Within 2 years, the insurgency begins. Within 5, Al-Qaeda in Iraq has mutated into something far more dangerous. By 2014, a group calling itself the Islamic State controls territory the size of the United Kingdom, governs 8 million people, and is executing hostages on video for the entire world to watch. The war America thought would last weeks lasted 8 years in its main phase, cost over $2 trillion. American soldiers dead, more than 4,000 Iraqi civilians killed, hundreds of thousands. The region doesn't go from unstable to stable, it goes from unstable to catastrophic. 8 years later, Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, 42 years in power, is overthrown with NATO air support. Another victory photo, another celebration in Western capitals. What follows is not democracy. Libya fractures almost immediately into armed factions, to rival governments, oil fields seized by militias, and then thousands of migrants flooding across the Mediterranean, triggering the worst refugee crisis Europe had seen in decades, and with it the rise of far-right political movements across France, Italy, Hungary, and Germany. Libya is still not stable. It has been 15 years. 2 countries, 2 dictators removed, 2 power vacuums, 2 catastrophes. The pattern is not complicated. When a strong man holds a country together through fear-suppressing ethnic, sectarian, and tribal fractures that go back centuries, removing him doesn't resolve those fractures. It detonates them. Iraq had its Sunni-Shia fault lines. Libya had hundreds of armed tribal factions. Both had been held in place not by shared identity, but by the weight of authoritarian control from above. The moment that control was removed, the pressure beneath exploded outward. The gap between destroying a regime and winning a war has cost America more than any foreign enemy ever has. Now let's talk about what makes Iran fundamentally different from Iraq and Libya, and why the pattern this time threatens to be worse. Iran is not a country with a simple power structure. At its center sits the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRG. This is not a conventional military. It is a parallel state within a state, with its own intelligence networks, its own economic empire worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and its own ideological command structure. Embedded into Iranian institutions for 45 years, you cannot kill the IRG by killing its figurehead. The IRG doesn't take its orders from one man, it takes its orders from a system. But here's the part that genuinely should keep strategists awake at night. Iran doesn't fight its enemies directly. It fights through proxies. For decades, Tehran built and sustained a network of armed groups across the entire region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, arguably the most sophisticated non-state military force on earth, with over 150,000 rockets and a political structure embedded into Lebanese society. Hamas in Gaza, the Houthi movement in Yemen, which has already demonstrated the ability to disrupt Red Sea shipping lanes, carrying a significant share of global trade, and dozens of Shia militia groups operating across Iraq and Syria, many of which already function with significant operational autonomy. Here is the uncomfortable truth no one in the White House appears to have thought through carefully enough. Khamenei told Hezbollah when to escalate and when to hold back. He told the Houthis when to strike and when to pause. He was the one figure capable of preventing any individual proxy from triggering a broader regional war by accident. He was the system's governor not because he was loved, but because he had spent decades carefully managing competing factions, regional commanders, and rival power centers within the IRG itself. Remove that authority and what you get is not the end of the proxy network. What you get is dozens of separate armed factions, each with their own grievances, their own local politics, their own definition of what the revolution now demands, all of them now free to act without any check from above. America didn't kill a snake. America cut the head off a hydra, and the hydra doesn't die. It grows new heads. On March 2, 2026, President Trump predicted the conflict with Iran would be over in 4 weeks. 4 weeks? That is almost exactly what American military planners said about Iraq. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld estimated the war would last 5 days or 5 weeks. The initial military phase lasted 3 weeks. The occupation that followed lasted 8 years. Afghanistan. The operation to topple the Taliban government took roughly 2 months. The war that followed lasted 20 years. The longest war in American history ended with the Taliban back in power and a chaotic evacuation from Kabul airport. There is a reason these predictions are always wrong. It is not because military planners are incompetent. It is because destroying a government and replacing it with something stable are two entirely different operations. Military power can destroy a regime in weeks. Political reality takes generations. Consider just one choke point. The Strait of Hormuz narrows to 33 kilometers at its tightest point. Through it flows roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. If Iran fractures into civil conflict and the URG's own internal divisions make this a real possibility, no single authority controls that strait oil prices spike, supply chains crack, and the United States finds itself not just fighting a ground war in Iran, but managing economic shockwaves rippling out to every connected economy on Earth. This is not worst-case scenario thinking. This is what happens when power vacuums form in strategically critical locations. Now here's the piece that changes the entire frame of this story. While Washington was watching Iran, someone else was watching Washington very carefully. On the morning of March 1, 2026, as American and Israeli jets completed their strikes and news of Khamenei's death spread across the world, officials in Beijing were not panicking. They were not alarmed. They were paying close attention because what was unfolding was precisely the kind of scenario China's long-term strategic planning had anticipated. China does not need to defeat the United States in a direct confrontation. It never has. China's strategy, consistent across decades of leadership, is built on a simpler, older principle: let your adversary exhaust itself. In 2003, America invaded Iraq. China spent that decade building the infrastructure of a manufacturing superpower. In 2011, America deepened its involvement in Libya and Afghanistan. China was extending the Belt and Road Initiative, locking in trade relationships and strategic infrastructure across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. Every time America looked away from the Pacific, China moved forward. The same dynamic is now repeating at far higher stakes. Taiwan, the South China Sea, American alliance commitments across the Indo-Pacific. All of these require American strategic attention, military resources, and diplomatic capital. Every carrier group monitoring the Strait of Hormuz is a carrier group not in the South China Sea. Every $1 trillion committed to another long war in the Middle East is $1 trillion not invested in the technological competition that will actually define the next 50 years. China doesn't need to fire a single shot at America to win this. It just needs America to stay distracted. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it was defeated militarily. It collapsed because it bled itself dry in Afghanistan, in an arms race it couldn't sustain, in the maintenance of a global posture it could no longer afford. America did not lose Iraq or Afghanistan to enemy armies. It lost them to time, to complexity, to the impossibility of imposing order on societies that had their own deeply rooted logic. China is patient. China thinks in decades. China does not celebrate the death of Khamenei. China takes careful note of what comes next and positions accordingly. History doesn't give us the luxury of knowing exactly what comes next, but it gives us patterns, and right now 3 scenarios are playing out in the minds of every serious strategist. In the first, Iran consolidates around a new supreme leader, possibly an URG commander, younger, more radical, and far less restrained than Khamenei. This figure doesn't inherit decades of carefully managed authority. He inherits rage, a nation humiliated by foreign airstrikes on its sovereign territory and a population that, whatever its feelings about the Islamic Republic, will rally around national dignity long before it rallies around foreign liberation. The proxy networks don't dissolve. They receive new instructions. The conflict doesn't end. It escalates. In the second, Iran fractures. The URG splits along factional lines. Kurdish groups in the northwest assert autonomy. Arab minorities in Khuzestan, sitting on Iran's largest oil fields, push for independence. Baloch separatists in the southeast intensify. You don't have one Iran to manage. You have 6, a collapsed state generating refugee flows that dwarf anything seen in Iraq or Syria, a power vacuum that Russia and China move immediately to fill. The third scenario, and perhaps the most likely, is a combination of both: partial consolidation, partial fragmentation. Iran becomes what analysts call a compound crisis, too fractured to function as a coherent state, too large and too heavily armed to be stabilized quickly. Afghanistan multiplied in the heart of the world's most energy critical corridor. None of these scenarios ends in 4 weeks. The global order America built after 1945, built on military primacy, alliance networks, and the ability to shape events on the other side of the world, is under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously: Russia in Europe, China in the Pacific, and now a new spiral of instability in the Middle East, pulling American attention and resources precisely away from the contests that will determine the next 100 years. Killing Khamenei was not a strategy, it was a moment. Strategy requires knowing what follows the moment and having the plan, the resources, and the political will to see it through to actual stability. America has demonstrated twice in the last 20 years that it can execute the strike. What it has not been able to execute is the peace. Iraq taught that lesson. Libya taught that lesson. And now, with a country 3 times larger, more strategically positioned, and more deeply embedded in the regional architecture than either of those, America may be about to learn it a third time. Headlines called this a victory. History will call it something different. The real question isn't what happens to Iran. The real question is this: can America afford another 20 years in the Middle East, while the country positioned to replace it as the world's leading power watches, waits, and moves? Drop a comment: which scenario do you think plays out? And if this gave you a perspective the headlines didn't, you know what to do.